Thank you so much for DoSAA for having me today and for affording this platform for such a timely and necessary conversation. I just want to take a couple quick minutes. I thank you for that lovely introduction, Shruti. And I want to share with you all a little bit about how, as a South Asian, I got involved in some of this racial trauma and anti-racism work, which for me really started about 5 years ago. And as Shruti mentioned, it was following the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, following the death of Michael Brown. But really what pushed me into this is some personal connections I have myself. So I am in a Blindian relationship. So my husband is Black, and we have now a son. So he is biracial, Black and Indian. And 5 years ago, following the 2016 election, I had this moment of clarity where it felt like I wasn't really truly understanding the experiences of my family members and my Black friends when I really thought I did, and I thought I understood that. And following the election, what happened was we were sitting there election night, and I was watching the results and really worried about where the country was headed. And my husband was rather flat and indifferent throughout the process. And for him, it was this feeling of learned helplessness. And I saw that throughout a lot of my friends and family. And that showed to me that I was missing something here. So that started my journey of unlearning and relearning a lot of colonization and systemic racism that has been ingrained in us. And it's been a long and trying process, but it's also highlighted for me how we have such very big needs in the psychological and mental health world too when it comes to supporting these communities. So I want to start with a quick activity. So I would like to ask everybody to turn their videos off to start and to set their Zoom setting for gallery view so that you can see as many boxes as possible on your screen. And I'm going to turn mine off too. And what we're going to do in a second is I'm going to read some questions. And if the question applies to you, I want you to turn your video on, or if you're not comfortable turning your video on, use one of the reaction buttons down in the corner. Either raise your hand or do a clap, something to indicate that it applies to you. So we're going to do a couple of these questions. So I'll start by turning my video off as well. So the first question I have for you is, so again, you're going to turn your video on if this question applies to you. Have you ever had a teacher or professional say to you, I don't know, maybe you should consider a different career path? Okay. Question number 2. Have you ever been denied a home or a car loan? Okay. 3. Has a stranger ever changed seats or crossed the street when they saw you approaching? Okay. Number 4. Has anybody ever said to you, you know, you're kind of smart for a insert race person? Question 5. Has anyone ever thought you were in the position you were in because of affirmative action? Number 6. Has anyone ever told you, you know, you're okay to date, but not to take home to the parents or marry? All right. So I like that activity because for me, what I see when I'm looking at most of the Black squares here is there isn't necessarily a strong response from the community to most of these questions. Usually, when I do this with more diverse groups, the boxes that change colors are people that are from BIPOC communities. So these everyday questions are microaggressions, but they're really insidious and they are pervasive. And we don't even recognize that it's happening for those of us who have the privilege to not have been asked these questions. And I want to start with this because I want to lay the framework for what we're going to speak about so we have common language here. But we're going to start with just kind of basics of understanding what we mean when we're talking about racism, what we mean when we're talking about systemic racism, and how then, as a community, and again, recognizing that as South Asians, we are not a monolith, but there are common themes that do promote anti-Blackness in our spaces. So really the goal of today is to summarize the impacts of racism and toxic stress on brain and behavior from this mental health standpoint. Also understand, again, how South Asian themes and expectations consciously and subconsciously uphold the systems that we embody and promote anti-Blackness, and really get us to start to think about reconceptualizing social determinants of health and our current models of mental health care. Let's start briefly with what racism is. It's essentially the belief that race is a primary determinant of human traits and capacities, that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. It's a political or social system. Our political and social system is founded on racism, which is important for us to remember. So when we talk about systemic racism, what do we really mean? It's an unfair structure that gives advantage to the white elite and disadvantages to Black people and other people of color. But within that other people of color, I think what's really important when we do anti-racism work is to be mindful of, again, our privileges in this space. So historically, we know America has a history of enslaving people, Black people, and this has been based on economic advantages of slavery to white people. And there's a cultural justification for this by espousing ideas of Black people as being lesser than or unintelligent. And we know this because there's been laws and systems that have just perpetuated this understanding time and time again. So although slavery ended with the 13th and 15th Amendments, we then saw the rise of Jim Crow laws, followed by the Civil Rights Act, which was supposed to end these injustices. But now we've got housing laws, policies that are related to the school to prison pipeline, police brutality, you name it, it's everywhere. In our medical system, our healthcare systems, it's everywhere. I have this brief video. I'm gonna refrain from showing it just for the sake of time, but I'm gonna plug it right now. If I would love for you all to go watch it. It's a wonderful visual 4-minute video of really detailing and highlighting systemic racism in layman's terms and like kind of really helping us gain more common language for how this happens and perpetuates generation after generation. And one of the things they highlight is redlining practices, right? So redlining practices that have kept Black communities from access to resources that are otherwise provided to other communities, specifically white communities. And this was interesting to me as I was doing my graduate work. I saw these results play out with some of my dissertation practices. So I went to school in Birmingham, Alabama for graduate school. And when you think of Birmingham, there's a really strong civil rights history. You think of the Deep South, and there's this this notion that it's highly racist, which it is. And this map I pulled to kind of understand and support some of my analyses I was seeing. But this is a census map from the 2010 census. And the dots here represent people in the city of Birmingham. So the green dots are white individuals. The blue dots are Black individuals. Orange is Latinx, and red is Asian. South Asian falls under the Asian category here. And if you look at the map, you can see the clear distinction, even by neighborhood here. There's almost a clear line separating the white neighborhood from the Black neighborhood, which really prevents socialization practices. It prevents being able to engage in discussion and interaction and build relationships. And you see the redlining occurring here. So the argument is, okay, sure, this is Birmingham, it's the South. We know the South is racist. So what I did was compare it to maps of other cities. And we look at New York and we look at LA, which are considered pretty diverse parts of our country. And you see the same redlining practices happening even in these cities that are considered progressive and diverse. So you'll see, although you see more color on these maps, they're all very centralized and localized, and they are segregated and separated. New York has more clear distinctions than the LA map, but that could also be because there's more Latinx representation in the LA communities too. So I like this visual to really highlight again how even currently these practices are so deeply embedded in our ability to engage with other communities. So let's talk about anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness is the systemic and interpersonal disregard for Black people, history, culture, emotions, wealth, really anything related to Black individuals. Anti-Blackness is subtle, but it can also be pretty explicit, and it's held together again by policies, culture, systems that actively oppress Black people and Blackness. It's a form of racism and specifically called to name the increased racism and harm that Black people face. Why is this important? Right? We work with, I predominantly work with children and families, so I get asked this question all the time. Like, why does this matter? Why do I need to think about this at all if I'm working with children? Well, infants as young as 6 months of age actually recognize race-based differences, and individuals 2 to 4 years old already start to internalize racial bias. So by the time you're 10 to 12 years of age, children actually become pretty set in their racial beliefs. So that gives us 10, maybe 12 years of time to really socialize our children and engage in anti-racist practices. So we as adults have to be really mindful of this from the get-go. And you have to start early and continue this process often, right? And I understood this from a psychological, developmental, social standpoint academically. The pandemic has forced me to see this play out with my own child, who only recently turned 1. I have seen the reverse in him. Because of the pandemic, all he sees are people of color. Between my husband and I and our family members, all of the representation he has in his books and the music videos, he watches Bollywood music videos to calm down and reggaeton music videos to calm down. That's his favorite. What he sees are people of color. So when we do meet with white families socially distanced, he has a completely atypical response. He is more reserved, he's kind of anxious, he's a little fearful. And it took me a while to kind of understand what was happening. And he was only 7, 8 months old when we really started seeing those changes. And then it registered for me that this is all he knows. So while for us, it's not necessarily the most concerning thing, because one day he will enter a predominantly white society and he will adjust, he will learn to adjust to those practices. The reverse is problematic, right? If we talk about white children, or even in South Asian communities, if we limit exposure to BIPOC communities, then our children are going to grow up and understand like a fear response when they encounter people who are different from them. And there aren't going to be opportunities for them to be corrective or have corrective responses if we're not teaching that to them early. So again, we know disparities exist, and the rise of the current civil rights movement following the George Floyd incident really solidified all of this data that we already know. These disparities exist for Black individuals prior to a child being born, and then they continue well after an individual existing. In the psychosocial sciences, we know things like an individual's life expectancy, living in a community in which they experience prejudice, is actually reduced by 20 years, which is a significant amount. Black children are 3 times more likely to lose a parent to death by the age of 10 compared to their white peers. Black children are also 2.5 times more likely to enter the welfare system for things that their white peers are not. And Black teenagers recently have reported a heightened risk for suicidal ideation and depression after increased exposure to police brutality videos that we have so readily accessible these days. So again, this really underscores our need as a psychological science to address some of these disparities more actively as well. What we know is that racial violence impacts children Black children grow up in a fear and a burden of having their behaviors restricted, and these incidents of racial violence can lead to things like anxiety, worry, threat, suspicion. I work with a wide range of kiddos, and one of my roles is providing psychological assessments for children and families. And over the last year, I've had countless BIPOC children report to me their fears related to police brutality in our psychological assessments, which are one, maybe two encounters that we might have. So there's not a prolonged or sustained clinical interaction, but even in those interactions, these fears have come out as being really real fears. I've had children as young as 4 and 5 report to me that they're afraid of existing as a Black child in America. One child cried to me and asked if he could change the color of his skin because he was worried about what would happen to him. And again, these experiences are really real, and they impact the symptomatology that we see in the room. So we, one, have to be recognizing it's there. Two, as clinicians and psychologists and researchers, we have to assess for it, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us, no matter how irrelevant it might seem to us because of our privilege. It's a very real part of the clinical picture for a lot of families. When we talk about kind of the impacts of racial violence, certain generations, certain communities have a stronger impact of intergenerational trauma, which might make their stress response appear more severe or more intense than perhaps other communities. And these behaviors, again, might come out as things like aggression, sadness, difficulties paying attention, sleep difficulties, a trauma response to witnessing racial violence, essentially. So this new term has been conceptualized to address these issues. So this notion of racial trauma is starting to pick up some steam. But again, there's been limited adaptation or application of what this means. So race-based traumatic stress can be is the cumulative effects of racism on an individual's mental and physical well-being. And why this is problematic is, again, it can present as symptoms that look like other psychological disorders. So if you think of my previous slide, aggression, sadness, pain, difficulties with attention, sleep, what does that look like? ADHD, anxiety, depression? But it could be related to the trauma, the racial trauma that an individual is experiencing. Not only that, racial trauma has also had implications with physical health and suicidal ideation too. So really quickly, when we're thinking of this notion of intergenerational trauma, what do we mean? So intergenerational trauma was first documented in the 60s, and it was first observed in children of Holocaust survivors, actually. There was a study that was conducted that found that the children of Holocaust survivors had heightened levels of anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Another study found that there were actually epigenetic markers in survivors of the Holocaust who experienced PTSD. And then similar findings were observed with Indigenous populations as well. There's emerging literature on the effects for Black communities and Black populations, but it's less well understood in terms of how slavery has epigenetically impacted the group. What we do know is research has suggested there have been more direct and indirect effects in terms of sociocultural factors. So direct effects like maintaining a sense of silence in certain spaces, indirectly experiencing heightened levels of poverty, a greater work burden, which then compromises things like parenting. And then Elena Sherpanoff talks a lot about survival messages that are passed on to children. And you might have heard of this as the talk that Black families need to have with their children, which is essentially needing to prepare them for the inevitable racism and prejudice that they will experience in the world. That has a sense of psychological impact on families and children, generation to generation, right? There's this fear of personal disclosure and a mistrust of medical providers in certain spaces because of historical trauma, historical medical trauma. I work for an institution where not too long ago, bodies were found under the University Medical Center, and they were Black bodies that were used for medical experimentation. And these individuals were kidnapped and grave robbed to be used for anatomy students. And this is common practice. We just don't talk about it. We just don't know this. But that interaction has had lasting impacts here in Richmond, Virginia for the Black community. There's a huge distrust in coming to my institution for medical care. There's a huge mistrust in applying the recommendations that we provide as medical professionals. And it's so important we understand where these barriers or this resistance is even coming from certain communities when we operate from our mental health standpoint as well. So it goes without saying, but I think we know that BIPOC communities also experience heightened sociocultural factors that have traditionally been termed as social determinants of health that relate to greater incidence of barriers and health outcomes, maladaptive health outcomes. And, the argument is that model of discussing social determinants of health actually really frames the issues as a bit of victim blaming in my perspective, right? We say to people, you don't have access to transportation, you don't have access to good nutrition, you don't have access to good education, so these are your issues. What we need to do is really kind of flip that on its head and think about how those barriers were put in place by systems to keep people from accessing those things, to perpetuate these health and mental health disparities. So, we can't talk about trauma, racial trauma, without talking about the ACEs. The ACEs were this landmark study that was conducted in the 1990s. It was a partnership between the CDC and Kaiser, and what they found was groundbreaking, really, for the medical world. And I really like these stats when speaking with South Asian professionals, really, because it has this like health connection, which I feel like, for whatever reason, resonates a little bit more. But what they found was that early childhood adversity related to the health outcomes that primary care doctors were seeing in their settings. So individuals who had a high ACE score or who experienced greater early childhood adversity, to include things like abuse, neglect, household dysfunction like parental mental illness, incarceration, domestic violence exposure, substance abuse exposure. Individuals who had higher experiences with that in early childhood, later in life and adulthood, had higher rates of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, alcoholism, stroke, lung disease. So these sociocultural experiences in early childhood were impacting their physical health 50, 60 years down the road. So this really underscored that this child maltreatment problem is really a public health concern that could be a preventable issue for a lot of communities. One of the most striking findings was that on average, people with an ACE score of 6 or higher, so if you had 6 or more incidences, your lifespan was cut short by 20 years, which is a significant amount of time. But as with most of our psychological science, the original ACE study was not inclusive by any means. So if you look at the norms in the population, it was primarily a white, college-educated, middle-income population. So this group out in Philadelphia not too long ago, 2012, decided that the original ACE study wasn't as inclusive or holistic as it needed to be. So they felt like it wasn't capturing their population in Philadelphia, which is predominantly Black population. What they saw in their population was that a quarter lived in poverty, 7 in 10 adults experienced at least one ACE, 1 in 5 experienced 4 or more ACEs, and there were several community level factors that they felt like were playing a role here. So they felt like witnessing community violence, living in foster care itself, bullying, experiencing racism and discrimination, and then feeling unsafe in your neighborhood were all things that the original ACEs was not taking into consideration. So they developed an additional 5 questions to address those ACEs. And what they found was that 40% of Philadelphians had experienced 4 or more of those expanded 5 stressors. So if you think back to my previous slide of 6 or more being so indicative of life expectancy, that's profound. And again, even in the trauma world, I was never taught of the Philadelphia ACEs, despite still being in graduate training when they were developed and disseminated. That was something I learned of well into my professional career. And so for me, it became really important. I start to incorporate those racial questions with all of the families I worked with. And I have an example for you with a Black male that I worked with. He was 30 years old. And I provided him the original 10 ACEs, and his original ACE score was a 0. So it was suggestive that he had no adverse childhood experiences. Really, he would be considered to have been set up pretty well to be functioning relatively well, right? When it comes to health outcomes, at least. Then I gave him the additional 5 ACEs, and his score jumped to a 5 out of 5. And his scores were related to toxic stress from racial and community factors, microaggressions in the workplace, being racially profiled by police on several occasions, exposure to community violence, knowing friends and family who had been shot and killed by the police, and then being impacted by institutional aspects of racism as well. So I share this experience again from a clinical and psychological standpoint in that if we rely on our current assessments that are widely used, we are missing a large part of the puzzle for BIPOC communities. So it's imperative we again think and expand our current work to be more inclusive of racial trauma experiences, because it can really alter and change the presentations, the interventions we provide, the assessments we provide, the research we're doing. It can really change those outcomes. Let's shift for a second to talk about our role as South Asians and how we maybe consciously and subconsciously promote these notions of anti-Blackness. So I'm sure many people are already familiar with the South Asian model minority myth, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. But we know it's a myth. We're not a monolith, right? But we are lauded as an example for how to overcome discrimination because of our social and economic successes. So generally speaking, the South Asian community that exists in the United States is a relatively privileged group. So even when you think of caste-based differences within the South Asian community, it is the privileged castes that typically exist here in the United States. I think Forbes just recently put out a statistic that South Asians are actually the most financially wealthy demographic in the United States. So this information and these opportunities really pits South Asians against Black communities in ways. It allows the dominant group to deny systemic racism and suggests that we could pull ourselves up by our bootstraps as immigrants and become successful and be in positions and places of power that are proximal to our white counterparts. So why can't Black people do it, right? And we do, in our proximity, also benefit from those privileges. So I just mentioned the financial benefits, but also being afforded spaces that Black individuals aren't afforded. That happens all too often. And this proximity, whether we are consciously aware or not, we are upholding those systems that are then oppressing other people by participating in those systems silently, really. So this notion of our silence in these spaces when we have this privilege, it upholds racist practices, and that's important for us to remember. So I'm sure many people have seen this white supremacy pyramid. It's gotten some feedback about maybe not being as inclusive, and maybe I think people have gotten offended by what's included in here, but I actually think it's a really great visual. So what is up top is considered socially unacceptable. So I think a majority of individuals consider things like lynching, blackface, use of the N-word as pretty overt white supremacy and unacceptable. And then what's under that black line is considered more covert practices that, again, whether we consciously are aware of or not, we're engaging in. And as the pyramid opens up, it's suggestive that those practices towards the bottom are much more common than that up top. But you'll see things like white silence, this notion of color blindness, denials of racism, tokenism, claiming reverse racism. All of those things really uphold, again, white supremacy and white supremacist systems. South Asians for Black Lives actually created a similar pyramid with anti-Blackness in South Asian communities, which I think is a nice representation of how South Asian communities specifically uphold these practices too. So again, if you think the top of the pyramid is overt anti-Blackness, but pretty frowned upon anti-Blackness, and down at the bottom is more covert and maybe less frowned upon, more easily permissible engagement in anti-Blackness. So, towards the bottom, code switching, not challenging family members or racist leaders, or this notion of just staying in our lane and being silent to avoid conflict. All of those practices to not rock the boat, they are relatively common and indicate a level of indifference within the community. And then again, some more of the veiled notions too that I don't think we realize we're engaging in, but again are privy to because of our proximity to whiteness, things like gentrification or even racist jokes. Like I like to have people think about something as little as, have you ever thought to when you look for a house or a place to live, have you classified it as good neighborhoods versus bad neighborhoods? Or have you looked for schools in good school districts? And do you know what that implies? And do you know what that means when you do purchase homes in those districts versus the less good school districts, right? Those are subtle ways that we contribute to upholding these systemic issues. So let's move again to this notion of stigma and expectations within the community. So when we say stigma, we're talking about the discrimination against a person or persons based off of perceivable social characteristics. Within the South Asian community, there are several themes that can present themselves as stigmas or expectations for members of the community. So these are themes that have been pulled from existing literature, which I'm sure many of you here can agree is sparse when it comes to academic literature, really well defining some of these concepts. But they probably won't seem foreign when I talk about them. So this notion of collectivism, right? South Asian communities are highly collectivistic, which essentially stresses the promotion of the family unit over individual needs. So things like honor, loyalty, obedience are expected. And this notion of saving face to promote family ideologies is strongly emphasized throughout our lives. Again, whether overtly and explicitly or even covertly in ways. Then this notion of rejection through high achievement is typically how it's referred to in academic literature, but this promotion of high achievement where it can feel like family transactions are conditional. In a lot of ways, we are conditioned to be high achieving, which again has its perks and its privileges. It gets us into spaces that other groups don't get into. But an individual's worth sometimes might be determined by their achievements or their successes too within the community. So children are encouraged to strive for high levels of success across all domains. Right? Like we are expected to kind of do more with our generational status, our immigration status, and whether that's from guilt and shame of what our ancestors and our family members have endured, or even direct messages of noting that family has moved here, so we expect you to do something with that, right? Then again, this notion of perfectionism, I think, is more strongly correlated in South Asian women, according to the literature, but it is there throughout the community. But it's an effort to promote high levels of success. So we might, in that process, be taught to avoid showing weakness in ourselves, and to kind of dismiss weakness in other people. It makes them less appealing if we see any type of weakness in them too, which makes things like mental health processes really difficult to discuss, and also things like anti-racism work really difficult to tackle. And we'll talk about why in a second here. And then lastly, traditionalism or conservatism. So typically, most South Asian communities are pretty conservative in their ideology, and this is pervasive into dating practices, even platonic relationship practices. So, individuals are often encouraged to kind of date within the community, date within the race, and this also informs things like actual sexual and dating practices as well. Any deviation from these notions towards engaging in partnerships, engaging in friendships, engaging in collegial relationships with Black individuals deviates from these prescribed roles and expectations. And I think about this anti-racism work sometimes as this like dissonance and this like Alice in Wonderland feeling, it feels like you know what is right and what should be done, but there's also a lot of shame and guilt in moving away from some of these themes and expectations that also kind of promote this unrest within you. So there are these contending factors. And in the literature, we know that things like collectivism and perfectionism and high achievement all contribute to greater rates of depression and anxiety within individuals who feel this pressure to, again, perform and ascribe to these roles. But similarly, when you're doing this anti-racism work, it also stews up a lot of those similar feelings because you're contending with going against the grain that is described for us, right? So to me, it feels like this moment of dissonance and tough, like Alice in Wonderland moment. And why this perfectionistic notion is so problematic for anti-racism work is because one of the key tenets of anti-racism work is acknowledging that we will be wrong through the process. We're always learning. We're always making mistakes, myself included. I make mistakes all the time through this process, but we have to take accountability for it and we have to name it when we're doing it, right? We have to name that we've been wrong. We have to name that we are willing to learn and move from there. That moves away from us being perfectionistic and showing this perfect persona to our community, our family, our friends. And again, it really kind of counters with what we know, which can make this really challenging to dismantle these notions within our communities. So I want to take a quick minute before we talk about how we address this. But I want you all to just engage in a little reflection, and we'll check the chat at the end if you're willing to share. But I'm going to throw out a couple of questions for you. Feel free to jot down your answers or just kind of keep them in the back of your mind. But think about these things, right? These are subtle ways in which we promote anti-Blackness. But I want you to first think, how old were you, or what was your first experience or exposure to anti-Blackness? The next question is, do you or have you ever had a large community or group of Black friends or colleagues? Why or why not? Number 3, have you ever been in a romantic partnership with a Black individual or a BIPOC individual, for making it even broader? Why or why not? Number 4, it's a question I alluded to earlier, but have you ever considered moving or buying a home to be or for the good schools in the neighborhood? Number 5, have you ever attended a predominantly Black event where you might be the only South Asian or non-Black person at the event? So, whether it be a cookout or a party, a bar, a block party, and if not, why not? So I'll let you all keep thinking about this as I keep talking, just because I want to make sure we get at least a few minutes at the end for some discussion. But really quickly talking through how our promotion of this anti-Blackness can impact a BIPOC individual. It can have direct effects on traumatic stress through the rejection that they might experience from our community, through the gaslighting that they might feel of their experiences, and then our silent complacency, like I've talked about, it really upholds these systems of oppression. For individuals who engage in relationships, whether that's platonic or romantic in any way, South Asian individuals might be in a position where they're making forced choices for their individual health and happiness or their families. They might experience things like stonewalling from the community and even something as large as disownment. So, one of my biggest points when doing racial trauma work and anti racism work is we recognize that this process is evolving and fluid. It will take patience, nurturance, and support. But one of the biggest things we have to do is we have to make space for race in our mental health atmospheres, in our personal life, in our professional worlds. We have to make space for race, which means we have to talk about it, no matter how uncomfortable that makes us feel. We aren't taught, we aren't trained in how to bring up race related issues, but it's necessary. And just like everything else, like we've gone through in our graduate training, over time it gets easier and it gets, you get better at bringing it up. And like I shared with you earlier, I practice racial socialization practices with all of my clients, even if I just have one interaction with them. And you would be surprised how many people take the invitation to engage. If somebody chooses not to engage with you, that's okay too. At least you've done your part in acknowledging that it's a part of the picture, right? That is it's up to them. It's their decision if they want to have that conversation with you, but it is our duty to create that space. Some things that help me, because what I've seen a lot in attempts towards solidarity or attempts towards allyship over the last year are some concerning things. It has this notion of transactional allyship in a lot of ways. So, what you see a lot of times is when we're talking about anti Blackness or anti racism work, sometimes people feel that that is an invitation to discuss their own oppression and their own struggles. And while there may be a time and place for that, typically in these spaces where the work needs to happen, it's not necessarily the most effective time to speak to your oppression or to compare oppression in any way. So, what happens a lot that people I don't think realize do are these 3 things, which are, I like to call them whataboutisms, centering, and then withdrawing or avoiding. So, an example of whataboutism is a Black person might say something like, well, Black people have experienced depression for over 400 years. And then someone responding with, why don't you ever talk about caste based oppression that's been existing for even longer? Right? Not the time. Yes, we know caste-based oppression exists. It is problematic. It needs to be addressed. But combating some of the anti-Blackness notions in that moment is not really the best approach. Similarly, centering, I don't think we realize we do this too, but if a Black or BIPOC individual comes to you and says something like, I've experienced a lot of microaggression and racism from the South Asian community, countering with, well, Black people have discriminated against me too, is not going to gain you any favors. And then lastly, I think what's all too natural for many people is this withdrawing and avoiding because it causes us discomfort. But an individual coming up to you to talk about their experiences with racism, and this example is common in the blending community, but a Black individual saying, well, my mother-in-law told me she thinks her children will be ugly because they'll be Black. And the South Asian individual responding with, I mean, you know how those aunties are, right? Just let it go. Do you want to just take your mind off of this and go catch a movie or something? That's avoiding, that's withdrawing from the conversation. So those are things we want to try to avoid doing. How we approach anti-Blackness, which again, this might not be new information because I think there's a lot of great sources out there these days, but building awareness within ourselves and our family members and our community, educating ourselves and taking the time to do that education, not relying on BIPOC individuals to do that for us. Self-interrogation, really the hardest part. This work is so, so hard. It will tear you down. It'll bring you to tears. It'll make you feel uncomfortable, but we need to do it. But interrogating your own process, your own identities, and how we've contributed to oppression. And then finally, community action. Like, what could you actually do? We don't want this to be performative, right? I love that quote of reading about mountain climbing does not make a mountain climber, right? We can't just read about this. We can't just talk about this amongst ourselves. We have to actually do something with it then. So what are your action steps moving forward? A reminder that this process is fluid. You are going to make mistakes. It's okay to say you've messed up. It's actually really important that that be kind of a common sentence in your vocabulary through this work. Accept the criticism, be open to it, try not to get defensive when it comes up, and then apply that learning that you take from that experience. Support Black businesses and creatives. There are so many wonderful ones out there that have already been doing this work in every stage and phase of life. And we know, again, if we've got the financial means and privilege, that's one easy way for us to support Black communities. Do the hard work, again, of confronting your loved ones. It's not easy. It can take time. As somebody who's been doing it for 15 years with her own family, it's trying, but take the time to do it. Identify what you're willing to give up. When you come from a place of privilege and we're trying to change the systems that provide us those privileges, we might have to give a couple of things up. So what are those things you're willing to give up? Figure out what those things are and then be okay when you have to give them up. And then ensure that you don't become lazy through this process. Performative allyship and activism is not going to help anybody. So how are you going to prioritize anti-racism work in your space? I am going to stop here, but I was going to talk very quickly about how our psychological sciences are very Eurocentric in research and practice. So we have to challenge those existing interventions, assessments, and research. But those are only a couple more slides. And I do have resources too I'm happy to share, but I want to leave at least a couple minutes for any discussion, whether you feel moved to share about your reflection questions or you have questions about anything I raised, anything at all. I want to make sure we take some time to talk. Don't be shy.
Dr. Ferguson, one thing that really struck me with what you were saying was that the pyramid picture that you shared about how anti-Blackness looks within Asian communities and South Asian communities specifically. And just kind of reading through that, I was struck by not only, what does that look like within my own family with my parents, but what am I complicit in as well? So I really appreciate you sharing that as well as other graphics that you brought up in your presentation. So thank you.
No problem. And yeah, I see Priya asked a question if I could share the last few slides and resources, and I'm happy to do that. I can send those of my slides.
Hi, I'm Julia. I tried to raise my hand, but I don't know if it came up. I'm just not showing myself because I'm in PJs, but I just wanted to say thank you. I think a lot of what you shared was very normalizing and validating in terms of thinking of many of us with our families. For me, my mom is Indian, and thinking about a lot of where my family comes from and some of the ways that anti-blackness is promoted that I think people are so unaware of. And so I think it was just helpful because sometimes that feels hard to start those conversations with friends when friends may not have that in their own families. They may not have those same experiences. So I appreciated that. And I am curious just to hear from you if there are any resources or things you might recommend reading that were helpful in terms of continuing to think about your own biases. Just would love to hear from that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually have a curated list of articles that are more mainstream articles, which are great because they help. You could even give them to family members or friends because they're less academic and less technical in terminology. But I remember one of them was, I think, titled "This is not about you." Or this activism work is not about you, or something along those lines. I can send that list to DoSAA as well, so that's available to people. But those works were really important for me because, like I said, it's been a very long process of learning and unlearning. And oftentimes I'll even find myself centering my experiences at times. And it's a stark reminder when I'm told, or even otherwise when I reflect on the experiences, to know that this moment is not about how I've been impacted by some similar systems, but really about me supporting and passing the mic, and then helping to do some of the work when BIPOC communities don't want to, or don't need to, or shouldn't have that burden. Some of those titles are escaping me off the top of my head, but there are some wonderful, like I said, more mainstream resources. And there's been a couple of questions in the chat too, kind of asking how you can approach these conversations with family members and community members that might not necessarily be as familiar with the terms. And I find these articles and these videos to be really helpful because it illustrates these things easily. And then the other thing that helps is, it's kind of tricky work, right? When you're talking about anti-racism practices globally and at a macro level, you want to avoid things like drawing comparisons. But when you are working with your family members, what is actually really helpful is if you could ask them to speak to their experiences of oppression, and ask them to speak to their experiences of things like colorism or prejudice and discrimination, and see if you can build some empathy that way. Um, and then doing some of the education on how those experiences that we or they have had are just so small and minor, really, in comparison to these larger systems that are at work against Black individuals. So that is a good starting point. And I think the hardest part for me in approaching it with family members and community members is the patience and the persistence, and watching my tone, because I'm a passionate person when it comes to some of these topics, and it's really hard for me to stay calm when somebody says something blatantly racist. But if you approach it with this dysregulation, we know through psychological science, right, that people will approach dysregulation with dysregulation. So trying to remain as neutral in that process is also really important.
Thanks, Anjali.
It looks like we have two questions, two hands up. So we'll start first with Kiran Patel, and then I'll get the other person.
I really appreciate your overview. You just presented this beautiful framework with terminology that anchors so much. So thank you for that. One question I had was just, when you use the word BIPOC, do you mean that to not include South Asians? Because that's what it sounded like. Okay. And that's actually different than how I've encountered the term up until now. And I'm curious if if you're aware of the different uses of that term, one that is inclusive of South Asians and other Asians, and one that's not, and if you could comment on that choice.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's been a little bit of debate within the world, really, on the use of the term. So I think originally, and if anybody else is more familiar with this, feel free to jump in as well. But I think originally the term was coined to categorize Black and Indigenous people of color and not include non-Black people of color. So there's a bit of a difference when it comes to, again, the systems and the barriers that are at play for Black and Indigenous people of color versus non-Black people of color, which is where South Asians and the larger Asian population fall under the people of color realm, but they don't fall in the Black and Indigenous people of color realm. So it's a bit more of a way to differentiate some of those systemic differences. There's also been recent debate I've been reading about just the term BIPOC in general. Some communities, including some Black communities, don't love it. They don't feel like it's as descriptive. So I think it's been a convenient term to use to make sure we're being inclusive of the Indigenous experience too, because they also experience a lot of these same barriers and difficulties. But there are also differences across minority groups.
Right. So, like, would Latinx folks be included in your term BIPOC? No, it would just be more strictly Black and Indigenous folks who are of color.
Yeah. And Latinx gets tricky, right? Because you can be white Latinx. I have several white Latina friends who experience white privileges. And then I have Afro-Latina colleagues who don't experience the same privileges. So it's important that even there, the ethnicity piece, we have to distinguish that too, to recognize that these barriers and practices look even different within the Latinx community.
I had another couple questions, but I also want to be sensitive to the time of the event and others that may need to ask something. So if there's time and you want to come back to me, or if you want me to just go ahead because there is time, that's fine too. I'll let you guys cue me.
Okay, why don't we go to the next question, and then if we all have time, we can come back to your question too. Okay, so we'll jump to Kiran Neelarambam. Sorry if I'm getting your name wrong, but you can go ahead and ask your question.
No, that was actually a good pronunciation of my name. Thanks. So I just wanted to introduce myself a little bit to kind of give you context of where my thoughts are coming from. First of all, I wanted to say that was a great presentation. Thank you so much for doing this. I think this is a necessary conversation in the South Asian community, and I'm glad we are having it. I am an immigrant. I moved here in my late 20s. So I've lived here for about 15 years now. So I have the experience of having lived in India. And what I'm finding and what I think is missing in the conversation is drawing a direct line between colorism, caste privilege, and anti-Blackness. I think there is a very direct line right there. And I think that's the part that shows up in a lot of the anti-Blackness that we see. And it's uncomfortable to talk about, especially when we know that a lot of the immigrant populations here are of the privileged caste. And I think what I have seen is that over generations, they seem to think that the privilege is disappearing. Like the parents had the privilege, but I don't have it, but you've benefited from it, right? Like my children are benefiting from my caste privilege. So I think that's an important part of the conversation that needs to be had openly and acknowledging our privilege in that way, rather than trying to be proximal to whiteness, which I think is a result of, again, of the same issues as well as colonization. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I think, having a conversation about anything related to South Asian mental health and disregarding colorism is a no-no, right? Like it's such a continued and huge part of of our history and our caste-based violence. And, it even makes me think of Meghan Markle's recent interview and her conversation with colorism within the Black community. So I think I appreciate you bringing that up. And I find it, and I'd be happy to hear and listen and just kind of hear other people's perspectives on how they approach this too. So I find it hard to bring that into a conversation again in the larger kind of like policy systems framework of addressing anti-racism. But I think the notion of colorism and caste-based violence, when we talk about this within our own communities, is really important. And why I struggle with raising it in these other larger systems is I personally feel like I end up centering my experience in that because colorism looks different in the Black community too. Colorism exists in the Black community. So yeah, I don't know how much people have been following the Harry and Meghan stuff. I'm a huge Meghan Markle fan, and watching that interview was heartbreaking. And then watching the colorism response in the Black community was really interesting. So several people were attacking her, saying that she has nothing to complain about because she's light skinned. So there's like, do people not see her and see that she's light skinned? Why would they think the baby would be black? And other people are saying, in support of her, like, this is horrific. There's the colorism is so pervasive, even in different minority communities, even within the Black community. I find it hard to kind of merge the two conversations in the larger systems world. But I would love to hear if other people have had successes there with that conversation.
I think those points are, I'm sorry, did I interrupt somebody?
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that I think the points you make are great, but I think a huge part of our work is also bringing this up, because I have a lot of South Asian clients. So doing the anti-racism work within our own community is useful. And I think that is where how colorism is attached to anti-Blackness and caste privilege is helpful in kind of helping them link and understand, right? Because a lot of times they don't understand and they don't see their anti-Blackness at all. And I think a huge part of the examination has to be internal, and even for psychologists and even for people in the field, right? Like, I don't think that's where the privilege work needs to happen. And I don't see that conversation often enough in our circles.
Yeah, I have to agree with you 100% on that. I think that silent complacency approach comes in, or withdrawing and avoiding from those discussions, even when it's so blatantly clear. Like, I'm even thinking of the response to Beyonce having a dark-skinned Tamil woman in her brown-skinned girl video, and then Bollywood coming out with a song that attacked Beyonce and Blackness in ways. And that wasn't criticized or critiqued nearly, or discussed nearly as much as it should be, as to why and how problematic that is, right? But I wholeheartedly agree with you, Karen, in terms of, I think we have to get creative in trying to draw parallels and build empathy within the South Asian community, so that there is more of a willingness to do the hard work and to confront the hard work. And sometimes making it personal and drawing those parallels is a helpful way to do that. Anybody else?
So I am just kind of looking at the time right now. And so I do want to make sure that, everyone does have questions answered. And Karen, I know you do have a few more questions, but yeah, just in the essence of time, I know that I personally do have to run. So what we'll do, firstly, thank you, Anjali, so much for talking and bringing up these really important conversations here. And if it's helpful with you all, we can figure out a way to also just, share some of the slides or materials that Dr. Ferguson is comfortable with sharing. So we can definitely do that. We'll send out the link to this video once it has been uploaded onto YouTube. And also we can share Dr. Ferguson's contact information as well, because I know a few of you might have further conversations that you'd like to continue to have.